Case 1. Eric Lyle Williams. Eric Lyle Williams stood before congregations as a justice of the peace in Kaufman County, Texas, a man sworn to uphold the law and administer justice. By April 2013, he had murdered 3 people in 2 separate executions, gunning down the prosecutors who had convicted him of theft and destroying the career he had spent decades building. The victims were Mark Hassa, an assistant district attorney, Mike McClelland, the district attorney, and Cynthia McClelland, Mike's wife, and a psychiatric nurse. All 3 were shot to death in calculated acts of revenge carried out by a former colleague who had once sat on the same side of the courtroom. Williams wore tactical gear, used his wife as a getaway driver, and sent taunting emails to the FBI framing a prison gang for the murders. When investigators finally traced the digital breadcrumbs back to his home router, they found a storage locker filled with the weapons he had used and the marked evidence of months of meticulous planning. Eric Williams was sentenced to death, and he remains on death row in Texas. Eric Lyle Williams was born on April 7, 1967, in Texas. He was raised in a middle-class family and was an active Boy Scout. He attended Texas Christian University, where he earned a bachelor's degree, and later graduated from South Texas College of Law with a law degree. He was licensed to practice law in Texas and built a career as an attorney before being elected Justice of the Peace in Kaufman County. He married Kim Williams, and the couple had no children. To those who knew him, Williams appeared to be a respectable local official, a man who had achieved a position of authority and trust. That reputation was destroyed in 2012 when Williams was convicted of theft by a public servant. He had stolen computer monitors from the county, a petty and inexplicable crime for a man earning a $70,000 judicial salary. The conviction cost him everything. He was removed from the bench, disbarred, and lost his private practice. His financial situation collapsed. Later, psychological evaluations would describe him as possessing extreme narcissistic traits. What he felt in response to the theft conviction was not remorse. It was rage. The prosecutors who had convicted Eric Williams were Mark Hassa and Mike McClelland. Hassa was 57 years old, an assistant district attorney known for his professionalism and dedication to public service. He was single and had devoted much of his life to his work. Mike McClelland was 63 years old, the elected district attorney of Kaufman County. His wife, Cynthia McClelland, was 65 years old and worked as a psychiatric nurse. The McClellands were married with adult children and were preparing for retirement. Both Hassa and McClelland were respected members of the community, known for their integrity and their prosecution of high-profile gang cases. They had no reason to believe that the man they had convicted of stealing computer monitors was planning to kill them. They had simply done their jobs. That professionalism made them targets. January 31st, 2013, 8:50 a.m. Mark Hassa walked toward the Kaufman County Courthouse at 100 West Mulberry Street in Kaufman, Texas. A figure in tactical gear approached him and fired multiple shots from a .357 handgun. Hassa was struck and killed. Bystanders found his body outside the courthouse. The murder sent shockwaves through the county. Prosecutors and judges went into lockdown, fearing that the killing was the work of a cartel or a prison gang retaliating for the office's aggressive prosecution of organized crime cases. No one suspected Eric Williams. 2 months later, on the evening of March 30th, 2013, Williams broke into the home of Mike and Cynthia McClelland in Forney, Texas. He shot both of them multiple times with a .223 assault rifle. A friend conducting a welfare check discovered their bodies. The murders were executions. Before and after the killings, Williams sent anonymous emails to law enforcement via the Tor network, a tool designed to hide the sender's identity. In the emails, he claimed responsibility on behalf of the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang. in an attempt to frame the organization and mislead investigators. He had spent months planning the attacks. He had rented a secret storage unit where he stockpiled weapons and tactical gear. His wife, Kim Williams, had served as his getaway driver. The investigation into the murders moved quickly. Once investigators identified Williams as a suspect, he had an obvious motive. Hasse and McClelland had prosecuted him, destroyed his career, and left him facing financial ruin. Texas Rangers and the FBI began building a case. The breakthrough came when investigators traced the taunting emails back to Williams' home router. Despite his use of the Tor network, the digital evidence pointed directly to him. A search of his secret storage locker revealed rare ballistics that matched the weapons used in both murders. The physical evidence was damning. On April 13, 2013, Eric Williams was arrested in Kaufman County and charged with capital murder. He was held without bond. Special prosecutors Bill Werski and Toby Shook were appointed to handle the case. The state announced it would seek the death penalty. Williams' wife, Kim, became a key witness for the prosecution. She confessed to her role as an accomplice and agreed to testify against her husband in exchange for a reduced sentence. The trial began on December 1, 2014, in Rockwall County Courthouse, the result of a change of venue. Judge Mike Snipes presided. The trial lasted 4 days. Prosecutors portrayed Williams as a ruthless sociopath, consumed by narcissistic rage, a man who could not accept the consequences of his own actions, and who had responded to a petty theft conviction by murdering 3 innocent people. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the prosecution had not proven Williams' guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The argument collapsed under the weight of the physical and digital evidence. Kim Williams took the stand and testified in detail about her husband's planning, the weapons, the storage unit, and her role as the getaway driver. The ballistics evidence tied the weapons in Williams' possession to the murders of Hasse and the McClellands. The emails traced back to his router. Williams did not testify in his own defense. On December 4, 2014, after deliberating, the jury convicted him of capital murder. On December 17, 2014, Judge Mike Snipes sentenced Eric Lyle Williams to death by lethal injection. In the courtroom, approximately 60 family members and friends of the victims gathered to witness the sentencing. J.R. McClelland, Mike's son, delivered a victim impact statement in which he called Williams a monster and a coward. Judge Snipes, in his remarks, compared Williams to Charles Manson and Jeffrey Dahmer, stating that Williams had committed acts of such depravity that he deserved to be grouped with the most infamous killers in American history. Williams showed no visible emotion. His appeals to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals were denied in 2017. He has continued to file petitions for habeas corpus relief, but his legal options are nearly exhausted. The state of Texas has indicated that it will request an execution date once all appeals are resolved. Eric Lyle Williams is 59 years old. He is incarcerated at the Allen B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, where he remains on death row. His inmate number is 999598. He will remain in that facility until his execution or until he dies of natural causes. The murders he committed led to sweeping security upgrades for prosecutors and judges across Texas, reforms designed to prevent another attack on officers of the court. 3 people are dead because Eric Williams could not accept responsibility for stealing computer monitors. He swore an oath to uphold the law in the very county where he later executed the district attorney and an assistant district attorney. His downfall came not from the murders themselves, but from his compulsion to taunt the FBI with emails, a final act of arrogance that provided investigators with the evidence they needed to bring him to justice. Case 2, Michael T. Joyce. The FBI surveillance photos were damning. A Pennsylvania Superior Court judge who had sworn under oath that a minor traffic accident had left him paralyzed by debilitating injuries was captured on camera scuba diving in the crystal blue waters off Jamaica, rollerblading through his neighborhood, playing 18 holes of golf, and piloting the private airplane he had purchased with the insurance money he had fraudulently obtained. Michael T. Joyce had claimed that a 5 miles per hour fender bender in August 2001 had caused such severe neck and back pain that he could barely function. Over the next 6 years, he systematically submitted forged and exaggerated medical claims, lied in sworn depositions to insurance adjusters, and collected $440,000 in settlements from Erie Insurance and State Farm. He used the money to buy a motorcycle, an outdoor hot tub, and a private airplane. While he was committing this fraud, he was sitting as an appellate judge on the Pennsylvania Superior Court, writing legal opinions and ruling on cases involving the exact same types of fraud he was perpetrating. In November 2008, a jury convicted him on all counts. He was sentenced to federal prison, disbarred, and stripped of his judicial pension. Michael T. Joyce was born on February 24, 1954, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He earned a bachelor's degree from Pennsylvania State University and a law degree from Franklin Pierce Law Center. He served in the United States Navy during the Vietnam War. After his military service, he entered private practice as an attorney and built a reputation as a competent lawyer. He was elected to the Erie County Court of Common Pleas, where he served as a trial judge and later elevated to the Pennsylvania Superior Court, an appellate court with statewide jurisdiction. The Superior Court is one of the most prestigious judicial appointments in Pennsylvania, and Joyce's elevation to that bench was seen as the culmination of a successful legal career. He was known as a law and order conservative who ruled with a firm hand. He was married and earning a 6-figure salary as an appellate judge. He had no prior criminal record. Despite his financial stability, Joyce wanted more. Greed drove him to construct an elaborate fraud scheme that would eventually destroy everything he had worked to achieve. The victims in Michael Joyce's fraud were Erie Insurance and State Farm Insurance, two of the largest insurers in the country. On a deeper level, the victims were the millions of honest policyholders whose premiums subsidize the costs of fraud. These institutions relied on the integrity of their insured clients, and they had no reason to doubt the sworn statements of a sitting appellate judge. When Joyce signed depositions and submitted medical claims, the insurers accepted his word. He was, after all, a judge. His position gave him credibility that an ordinary claimant would never have enjoyed. That trust made the fraud possible. August 2001. Joyce was involved in a minor traffic accident. His vehicle was struck at approximately 5 miles per hour. The impact caused minor damage to his bumper. The airbags did not deploy. Any reasonable observer would have classified the accident as trivial. Joyce saw an opportunity. He launched a scheme to defraud his insurers by claiming that the accident had caused catastrophic injuries. He told insurance adjusters that he was suffering from severe, debilitating neck and back pain that left him unable to work, unable to engage in physical activity, and unable to live a normal life. Over the next 6 years, from 2001 to 2007, Joyce systematically submitted forged and exaggerated medical claims. He lied in sworn depositions, describing symptoms and limitations that did not exist. He portrayed himself as a man whose life had been destroyed by the accident. The insurers, believing his claims, paid out settlements. By the time the fraud was discovered, Joyce had collected $440,000 from Erie Insurance and State Farm. He used the money to fund a lifestyle that directly contradicted his claims of disability. He purchased a motorcycle, an outdoor hot tub, and a private airplane. He scuba dived in Jamaica, rollerbladed, golfed, and flew his plane. All the while, he continued to serve on the Pennsylvania Superior Court, presiding over appeals and writing legal opinions that shaped Pennsylvania law. The fraud might have continued indefinitely, but the FBI received tips that the debilitated judge was anything but incapacitated. The FBI's white-collar crime division in the Erie field office launched a covert surveillance operation. Agents followed Joyce and documented his activities. They obtained photographs and video footage of him engaging in extreme physical activities that would have been impossible for someone suffering from the injuries he claimed. The evidence was incontrovertible. Joyce was photographed scuba diving in Jamaica, an activity that requires significant physical exertion and coordination. He was recorded rollerblading and playing 18 holes of golf. His flight records showed that he was piloting his private airplane, a task that demands both physical capability and mental acuity. Scuba instructors and golf partners were interviewed, and they testified that Joyce showed no signs of physical limitation. The FBI spent years building a federal case. In August 2007, Joyce was indicted on 2 counts of mail fraud and 6 counts of money laundering. When the indictment was announced, Joyce refused to resign from the bench. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court suspended him with pay, a controversial decision that allowed him to continue collecting his judicial salary while under indictment. He pleaded not guilty and prepared for trial. The trial began in October 2008 in the United States District Court in Erie, Pennsylvania. Judge Maurice B. Cohill, Jr. presided over the proceedings. The trial lasted several weeks. The prosecution's strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. They presented the jury with 2 sets of images. The first set showed photographs of Joyce's vehicle after the accident. The damage was minimal, a small scratch on the bumper, barely visible. The second set showed photographs of Joyce scuba, diving in tropical waters, golfing on manicured courses, and standing beside the private airplane he had purchased with the stolen money. Prosecutors walked the jury through Joyce's scuba diving logs and flight records, demonstrating that he had been engaging in strenuous physical activities throughout the period when he claimed to be disabled. The defense argued that Joyce's injuries were real but episodic. They claimed that he experienced good days when he could play golf and fly airplanes, and bad days when he was paralyzed by pain. The jury was not convinced. The episodic pain defense could not explain the systematic fraud, the forged medical documents, or the lies told under oath. On November 19, 2008, the jury convicted Michael T. Joyce on all counts, including mail fraud and money laundering. On March 10, 2009, Judge Maurice B. Cohill, Jr. sentenced Michael T. Joyce to 46 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Joyce was also ordered to pay $440,000 in restitution to the insurers he had defrauded. In his remarks at sentencing, Judge Cohill noted the extreme arrogance required for a sitting appellate judge to commit such blatant fraud. He stated that Joyce's conduct had cast a shadow over the entire judiciary and had undermined public trust in the legal system. Joyce's legal career was over. He was formally disbarred and stripped of his judicial pension. He filed appeals to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, arguing that his conviction should be overturned. The appeals were denied. He petitioned the United States Supreme Court to hear his case. The court declined. By 2010, Joyce had exhausted all avenues for appeal. He served his sentence at a federal correctional facility and was released in 2012. Michael T. Joyce is 70 years old. He was released from federal custody in 2012 after serving his sentence. He lives in privacy as a disgraced former judge, stripped of his law license, his judicial pension, and his reputation. The case became a subject of extensive media coverage in Pennsylvania and in legal circles across the country. A cautionary tale about the consequences of judicial arrogance and greed. The irony of Joyce's case is inescapable. While he was committing massive insurance fraud, he was actively sitting on the appellate bench, writing legal opinions and ruling against everyday citizens who were accused of the exact same types of fraud he was perpetrating. He used the money stolen through fake injuries to buy a private airplane and fund an active lifestyle he claimed he could no longer enjoy. His case led to stricter oversight protocols for judges facing criminal indictment in Pennsylvania, reforms designed to prevent another judge from collecting a salary while under investigation for serious crimes. Case 3. Thomas J. Maloney. A Cook County Circuit Court judge accepted a $100,000 bribe to acquit 2 men accused of murder. When he suspected the FBI was closing in, he panicked, returned the money, and sentenced the defendants to death to cover his tracks. Thomas J. Maloney had spent nearly a decade selling justice from the bench, taking cash payments to guarantee acquittals in bench trials for members of the El Rucan street gang and mafia hitmen accused of double murders. He operated through a network of bagmen, intermediaries, who collected cash from defense attorneys and delivered it to Maloney in exchange for predetermined verdicts. He presided over trials where the outcome had been decided before the first witness was called. By the time the FBI's massive undercover operations, Operation Greylord and Operation Gambat, brought him down, Maloney had corrupted the Cook County court system for years. In April 1993, a federal jury convicted him of racketeering, extortion, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 15 years and 9 months in federal prison and became a symbol of the judicial corruption that had plagued Chicago for decades. Thomas J. Maloney was born in 1925. Before ascending to the bench, he worked as a criminal defense attorney, often representing mafia hitmen and organized crime figures. His background in criminal defense gave him connections to the underworld, relationships that would later facilitate his corruption. He was elected to the Cook County Circuit Court, where he presided over criminal bench trials. In bench trials, the judge alone determines guilt or innocence. There is no jury. Maloney wielded absolute power over the fates of the defendants who appeared before him, and he used that power to enrich himself. He had no prior criminal record before the federal investigation began, and to the public, he appeared to be a respected jurist administering justice in one of the nation's busiest court systems. The victims of Thomas Maloney's corruption were the families of murder victims whose killers walked free because a judge had been paid to acquit them. They were the defendants Maloney sentenced to death when he feared exposure, men who may have been guilty, but whose fates were determined not by the evidence, but by Maloney's panic. They were the citizens of Chicago who expected the court system to deliver impartial justice, and who received instead a marketplace where verdicts were bought and sold. The integrity of the justice system itself was a victim, undermined by a judge who treated his courtroom as a criminal enterprise. Between 1977 and 1986, Thomas Maloney routinely accepted bribes to fix cases. The standard price was $10,000 or more, depending on the severity of the charges. Defense attorneys who wanted to guarantee an acquittal for their clients would arrange payment through intermediaries known as bagmen. The bagmen would collect the cash and deliver it to Maloney. In exchange, Maloney would acquit the defendant, regardless of the evidence presented at trial. He fixed cases for members of the El Rucan street gang, a violent Chicago organization involved in drug trafficking and murder. He fixed cases for mafia hitmen accused of executing rivals. The system was efficient and lucrative. Maloney's most shocking act of corruption involved a $100,000 bribe. 2 defendants were on trial for murder, and their attorneys arranged for Maloney to receive the payment in exchange for an acquittal. Maloney accepted the money, but as the trial proceeded, he became convinced that the FBI was watching him. Panicked, he returned the $100,000 and reversed course. He convicted the defendants and sentenced them to death, hoping that the severity of the sentence would deflect suspicion and convince investigators that he was not corrupt. The move was calculated and cold-blooded. The defendants, who had paid for their freedom, were instead sent to death row because Maloney feared exposure. The FBI had been investigating judicial corruption in Chicago for years. Operation Greylord and Operation Gambit were massive undercover operations designed to root out bribery and extortion in the Cook County court system. Investigators used wiretaps to record conversations between corrupt judges, attorneys, and bagmen. They recruited cooperating witnesses, including some of the bagmen who had delivered cash to Maloney. One of Maloney's fellow judges agreed to wear a wire and recorded conversations with him. The evidence accumulated over years of painstaking investigative work. When federal prosecutors finally brought charges, they had wiretaps, testimony from insiders, and a clear pattern of corruption spanning nearly a decade. Maloney was charged with racketeering conspiracy, extortion, and obstruction of justice. He pleaded not guilty and prepared to fight the charges in court. In April 1993, Thomas Maloney went to trial in federal district court in Chicago. The prosecution presented wiretaps that captured incriminating conversations. They called lawyers who had paid bribes and bagmen who had facilitated the transactions. A fellow judge testified about Maloney's conduct and the recordings he had made while wearing a wire. The evidence was overwhelming. Maloney's defense could not overcome the weight of the testimony and the recordings. The jury convicted him on all counts. The judge sentenced Thomas Maloney to 15 years and 9 months in federal prison. He served 12 years before being released. Thomas Maloney died in 2008 at the age of 82. He had been released from federal prison after serving his sentence, but his legacy was not one of judicial service. It was one of betrayal and corruption. He had accepted a $100,000 bribe to free murderers, then sentenced those same men to death when he feared the FBI was closing in. His willingness to manipulate life and death decisions for cash demonstrated a level of moral bankruptcy that shocked even seasoned investigators. The families of murder victims who had watched their loved ones' killers walk free because a judge had been paid off were left without closure or justice. Operation Greylord and Operation Gambit, the investigations that brought Maloney down, exposed a culture of corruption in the Cook County courts that required years of federal intervention to dismantle. Maloney's conviction sent a message that even judges were not above the law, but for the victims of his corruption, that message came too late. Case 4. Sol Wachtler. The chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals, the highest judicial officer in the state and a frontrunner for governor, was arrested by the FBI while wearing a disguise and dropping an extortion letter into a public mailbox. Sol Wachtler had spent months stalking and extorting his former mistress, Joy Silverman, using voice-altering devices, threatening to kidnap her adult daughter and demanding $20,000 in cash. The threats were explicit and terrifying. The methods were cartoonish, disguises, fake identities, and technology designed to obscure his voice. The crime was made even more surreal by the fact that Wachtler, as chief judge, had authored major legal decisions expanding anti-stalking laws in New York. He was violating the very protections he had written into law. In November 1992, federal agents caught him in the act. He was convicted of extortion and mailing threatening communications and sentenced to 15 months in federal prison. His legal career, his political ambitions, and his reputation were destroyed. Sol Wachtler was born on April 29, 1930. By the time of his arrest in 1992, he was 62 years old and at the pinnacle of his career. He served as chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals, the highest court in the state, a position that made him one of the most powerful judicial figures in the country. He was widely regarded as a brilliant legal mind, someone whose opinions shaped New York law and influenced courts across the nation. He was considered a serious contender for governor of New York, a position that would have elevated him to national political prominence. Wachtler had authored significant decisions on criminal law, civil rights, and procedural reforms. Among those decisions were rulings that expanded and strengthened anti-stalking protections, legal safeguards designed to protect victims from obsessive and threatening behavior. That work made his own crimes all the more shocking. Joy Silverman was a wealthy socialite and Wachtler's former mistress. The two had carried on an affair, but Silverman ended the relationship. For most people, the end of an affair is painful but final. For Wachtler, it was unacceptable. He could not let go. What followed was a campaign of harassment, extortion, and terror that would consume more than a year of his life and ultimately destroy it. Between 1991 and 1992, Sol Wachtler adopted an alter ego. He called himself David Purdy. Using this fictional identity, he began sending extortion letters to Joy Silverman. The letters demanded $20,000 in cash. Wachtler threatened to release embarrassing audio recordings of their affair, recordings that he claimed would humiliate Silverman and damage her reputation. The threats escalated. Wachtler explicitly threatened to kidnap Silverman's adult daughter, a tactic designed to terrorize her into compliance. He used voice-altering devices during phone calls to disguise his voice, hoping that the distorted sound would prevent Silverman from recognizing him. He wore physical disguises when delivering letters, attempting to avoid detection by surveillance cameras or witnesses. The harassment continued for months, a relentless campaign of psychological torture directed at a woman who had simply ended a relationship. Joy Silverman did not comply with the extortion demands. Instead, she went to the FBI. Federal agents opened an investigation and began tracing the threatening calls and letters. They conducted surveillance on the locations where the letters were being dropped. On November 7, 1992, FBI agents observed Sol Wachtler disguised and attempting to remain inconspicuous, dropping an extortion letter into a public mailbox. They arrested him on the scene. The chief judge of New York's highest court was taken into federal custody and charged with extortion and mailing threatening communications. The trial and legal proceedings that followed were a spectacle. Wachtler, once a towering figure in New York's legal community, was now a defendant facing serious federal charges. The FBI had traced the calls and letters, documented the disguises, and caught him delivering an extortion demand. The voice-altering devices and disguises were not sufficient to create reasonable doubt. Wachtler was convicted of extortion and mailing threatening communications. The court sentenced him to 15 months in federal prison. He was disbarred, stripped of his judicial authority, and permanently removed from public life. His political career, which had seemed destined for the governor's mansion, was over. Sol Wachtler served his sentence and was released from federal prison. He was disbarred and has lived in relative obscurity since his release. If he is still alive in 2026, he would be 93 years old. The case became a cautionary tale about power, obsession, and the dangers of unchecked ego. Wachtler had been one of the most respected jurists in the country, a man whose legal opinions were studied in law schools and cited by courts nationwide. As chief judge, he had authored decisions that expanded protections for stalking victims, establishing legal precedents that helped countless people escape abusive situations. Then he became a stalker himself using the same tactics: threatening communications, obsessive harassment, attempts to terrorize, that his own legal rulings had sought to prevent. The irony was not lost on observers. The man who had written the law against stalking violated that law using voice-altering devices and disguises that belonged in a bad crime novel. His brilliance, his reputation, and his future were destroyed by his inability to accept the end of an affair. Case 5. Samuel B. Kent. A United States District Judge appointed for life turned his federal chambers into a hunting ground. Samuel B. Kent repeatedly sexually assaulted the women who worked for him, using his untouchable status as a lifetime appointed federal judge to terrorize his staff. The victims were Kathy McBroom and Donna Wilkerson, court employees and case managers who reported directly to Kent and who endured years of abuse because they feared losing their jobs if they spoke out. When the women finally filed formal complaints, Kent lied to the Judicial Council investigating the allegations, obstructing justice in an attempt to cover up his crimes. In a historic move, the United States House of Representatives impeached him, and the Senate prepared to convict him on sexual assault charges, making him the first federal judge in American history to face removal for such conduct. Rather than endure a Senate trial, Kent resigned. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, admitted to the sexual abuse as part of his plea, and was sentenced to 33 months in federal prison. He was released in 2011. Samuel B. Kent was born on June 22, 1949. He was appointed to the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas by President George H.W. Bush, a lifetime appointment that gave him near absolute authority within his courtroom and chambers. Federal judges appointed under Article 3 of the Constitution serve for life, barring impeachment or voluntary resignation. That security of tenure is designed to protect judicial independence, ensuring that judges can make decisions without fear of political retribution. In Kent's case, that protection became a shield for predatory behavior. He used his position to prey on the women who worked for him, knowing that his lifetime appointment made him nearly immune to accountability. Kathy McBroom and Donna Wilkerson were adults working as court employees and case managers in Kent's chambers. They were his direct subordinates, meaning that he controlled their work assignments, their evaluations, and effectively their livelihoods. The power imbalance was absolute. Kent was a federal judge with a lifetime appointment. They were employees who could be terminated at will. For years, they endured his abuse in silence, trapped by economic necessity and the knowledge that challenging a federal judge would almost certainly result in their termination and the destruction of their careers. Between 2003 and 2007, Samuel Kent repeatedly sexually assaulted Kathy McBroom and Donna Wilkerson in his chambers. The assaults occurred in the federal courthouse, a place that is supposed to represent the rule of law and the impartial administration of justice. Kent used his position of authority to access his victims and to ensure their silence. The women were vulnerable because they depended on their jobs, and Kent exploited that vulnerability. The abuse continued for years. When the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals Judicial Council finally opened an investigation into the allegations, Kent lied under oath. He denied the assaults and obstructed the investigation, hoping that his word as a federal judge would be enough to end the inquiry. It was not. The victims filed formal complaints after years of suffering in silence. The complaints triggered an investigation by the Judicial Council, which has authority to discipline federal judges for misconduct. During the investigation, Kent lied repeatedly, denying the allegations and attempting to discredit the women who had accused him. Federal prosecutors eventually charged him with aggravated sexual abuse, abusive sexual contact, and obstruction of justice. Rather than face trial, Kent entered into a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and, as part of the plea, admitted to the sexual abuse. The admission was significant. Kent had spent years denying the allegations, and his guilty plea was a public acknowledgement that the abuse had occurred. The court sentenced Samuel Kent to 33 months in federal prison. The sentence was relatively light given the severity of the crimes, a fact that angered the victims and their advocates. But the legal proceedings did not end with the criminal sentence. Kent refused to resign from the bench, hoping to retain his lifetime appointment and his federal pension. His refusal triggered a political response. The United States House of Representatives voted to impeach Samuel Kent, making him only the second federal judge in modern history to be impeached. The charges were based on his sexual abuse of court employees, his obstruction of justice, and his refusal to resign. The Senate prepared to hold a trial, and it became clear that Kent would be convicted and removed from office. Facing the inevitability of conviction, Kent finally resigned. His resignation made him the first federal judge in American history to be impeached by the House and to face Senate conviction on sexual assault charges. Samuel Kent was released from federal prison in 2011 after serving his sentence. His current age and whereabouts are not publicly documented, but the consequences of his actions extend far beyond his personal disgrace. He turned his federal chambers, a place that should have been a model of professionalism and integrity, into a site of predation. He used his lifetime appointment, a constitutional protection designed to safeguard judicial independence, as a weapon to terrorize the women who worked for him. Kathy McBroom and Donna Wilkerson endured years of abuse because they feared the professional and financial consequences of challenging a federal judge. When they finally came forward, Kent lied and obstructed justice, prioritizing his career and reputation over accountability. His impeachment and forced resignation were historic, a rare instance of the federal government holding one of its own judges accountable for sexual misconduct. The case sent a message that even lifetime appointed judges are not above the law. But for the women Kent victimized, that accountability came only after years of suffering. Case 6, Mike Maggio. A jury in Arkansas heard the horrific details of how 76-year-old Martha Bull had died in agonizing pain at a nursing home in Greenbrier after staff ignored her symptoms for days. The jury awarded her grieving family $5.2 million in damages, holding the nursing home owner, Michael Morton, accountable for the preventable death. The family believed the court system would uphold the verdict. With a single signature, Faulkner County Circuit Judge Michael Allen Maggio reduced the $5.2 million award to $1 million, erasing most of the compensation the jury had determined was just. The reduction was not based on legal principles or a careful review of the evidence. It was a bribe. Shortly after Maggio signed the order reducing the verdict, Michael Morton's companies funneled $50,000 into political action committees supporting Maggio's campaign for the Arkansas Court of Appeals. The quid pro quo was direct and documented. Text messages and bank records showed the arrangement. On March 24, 2016, U.S. District Judge Brian Miller sentenced Maggio to 10 years in federal prison, telling him, "You were bought." Michael Allen Maggio was born in 1961 in Arkansas. He earned his law degree from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock and built a career as a private attorney before seeking judicial office. He was elected as a Faulkner County Circuit Judge, a position that gave him authority over civil and criminal cases in one of Arkansas's growing suburban counties. He was 52 years old when he accepted the bribe, a man with no prior criminal record who appeared to be a respected member of the legal community. But Maggio had ambitions that extended beyond the circuit court bench. He wanted to be elected to the Arkansas Court of Appeals, a statewide appellate court that would give him greater prestige and influence. That ambition required campaign funding, and Maggio was willing to sell a jury verdict to get it. Maggio also had a digital presence that would contribute to his downfall. Under a pseudonym, he posted misogynistic and racist comments on an LSU sports message board. Crude and offensive remarks that eventually attracted the attention of investigators and led them to scrutinize his broader activities. Martha Bull was 76 years old when she died. She was a retired woman who had lived a full life and who should have been able to spend her final years in comfort and dignity. Instead, she died at a nursing home in Greenbrier, Arkansas, in agonizing pain, after staff members ignored her symptoms for days. Her death was preventable. The nursing home staff had failed to provide even basic care, and that failure cost Martha her life. She was survived by adult children who loved her and who sought accountability through the legal system. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the nursing home and its owner, Michael Morton. The case went to trial, and the jury heard testimony about the neglect Martha had suffered and the pain she had endured before her death. The jury awarded the Bull family $5.2 million in damages, a verdict that reflected the severity of the nursing home's misconduct and the value of Martha's life. The family believed that the court would uphold the jury's decision. They expected Judge Maggio to administer justice. That expectation was misplaced. In 2013, the Bull family's wrongful death case was assigned to Judge Michael Maggio. After the jury returned its $5.2 million verdict, Michael Morton's attorneys filed a motion asking Maggio to reduce the award. Behind the scenes, Maggio was communicating with lobbyists connected to Morton. Text messages recovered during the investigation showed that Maggio and the lobbyists had discussed the case and the political support Maggio needed for his appellate court campaign. The arrangement was explicit. Morton's companies would contribute $50,000 to political action committees supporting Maggio's campaign. In exchange, Maggio would reduce the jury's verdict. Maggio signed an order cutting the $5.2 million award to $1 million, a reduction of more than $4 million. The timing of the campaign contributions was not coincidental. Shortly after Maggio signed the order, money began flowing from Morton's business interests into PACs supporting Maggio. Bank records and campaign finance ledgers documented the transfers. The evidence was clear. Maggio had sold a judicial decision for $50,000 in campaign contributions. Maggio's downfall began not with the bribery investigation, but with his online behavior. Investigators looking into his pseudonymous posts on the LSU sports message board began to examine his financial activities and uncovered the corrupt campaign donations. The scrutiny intensified. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Arkansas opened an investigation into the connection between the reduced verdict and the campaign contributions. Investigators obtained Maggio's text messages, which showed his communications with lobbyists about the case and the political support he expected in return. They obtained bank records and campaign finance reports that traced the flow of money from Morton's companies to the PACs supporting Maggio. The evidence demonstrated a direct quid pro quo: cash for a judicial ruling. Federal prosecutors charged Maggio with honest services fraud, a federal offense that criminalizes bribery and corruption by public officials. Maggio pleaded guilty, admitting to the scheme rather than face trial. On March 24, 2016, U.S. District Judge Brian Miller sentenced Michael Allen Maggio to 120 months in federal prison, the equivalent of 10 years. In his remarks at sentencing, Judge Miller did not mince words. "You were bought," he told Maggio. Miller emphasized that judicial bribery strikes at the very foundation of the republic, undermining public trust in the courts and making a mockery of the rule of law. The sentence was severe, reflecting the seriousness of Maggio's betrayal. Federal sentences require defendants to serve at least 85% of their time, meaning that Maggio would spend approximately 8.5 years in federal custody. Based on his sentencing date, Maggio was scheduled for release in late 2024 or early 2025, meaning he is likely a free man as of 2026, though his conviction and disbarment are permanent. Michael Allen Maggio is 62 years old. He is likely no longer incarcerated, having completed his federal sentence. He was formally disbarred and will never practice law or serve as a judge again. The case became a national symbol of judicial corruption, covered extensively in media reports that focused on the cruel irony of a judge selling out a grieving family for campaign cash. Martha Bull died in agony because a nursing home failed to care for her. Her family sought justice through the legal system and won a verdict that reflected the harm she had suffered. Judge Maggio erased most of that verdict with a single signature, trading their pain for $50,000 in political contributions. The jury's careful deliberation, the evidence presented at trial, the family's suffering, all of it was meaningless to Maggio. He saw a transaction. The case led to reforms in Arkansas, including tighter restrictions on judicial campaign financing and closer scrutiny of PAC contributions to judicial candidates. But for the Bull family, those reforms came too late. Their mother's death had been reduced to a line item in a corrupt political transaction, and the judge who betrayed them spent less than a decade in prison before walking free. Case 7. Robert F. Collins. The FBI agents who raided the chambers of U.S. District Judge Robert Frederick Collins found $16,500 in marked bills hidden in his office safe, physical proof that a sitting federal judge had accepted a $100,000 bribe to reduce the prison sentence of a convicted drug smuggler. Collins was a man of historic significance. He was the first African-American federal judge appointed in the Deep South, a barrier-breaking figure whose elevation to the bench had been seen as a milestone in the fight for civil rights and equal justice. By 1989, he had become something else entirely, a corrupt jurist willing to sell his authority for cash. The drug smuggler who had offered the bribe was cooperating with the FBI, and the entire transaction was part of a federal sting operation. When Collins was arrested, charged, and convicted in 1991, he became the first federal judge in United States history to be convicted of bribery. He was sentenced to 6 years and 10 months in federal prison. He served 12 years before being released and died in 2001, his legacy forever defined not by his groundbreaking appointment, but by his betrayal of the judicial oath. Robert Frederick Collins was born in 1931. By the time of his appointment to the federal bench, he was 60 years old and had spent decades working in the legal system. His appointment as a U.S. District Judge in Louisiana was historic. He was the first African American to serve as a federal judge in the Deep South, a region with a long and painful history of racial segregation and discrimination. His appointment was celebrated as a victory for justice and equality, a sign that the federal judiciary was finally beginning to reflect the diversity of the nation it served. Collins' position gave him enormous authority. Federal judges wield significant power, presiding over cases involving constitutional rights, federal crimes, and disputes between states. They are appointed for life, a protection designed to insulate them from political pressure and allow them to make decisions based solely on the law. Collins had achieved a position of immense respect and influence. What he did with that power would destroy his legacy. The victim in Robert Collins' bribery case was not an individual, but an institution, the federal justice system itself. When a judge accepts a bribe, the integrity of every decision he has ever made is called into question. Defendants who appeared before Collins litigants who believed their cases would be decided impartially, and the public who relied on the federal courts to administer justice fairly were all victimized by his corruption. The specific defendant, whose sentence Collins agreed to reduce, was also a victim, in a sense, manipulated by a corrupt system where justice was for sale. Every case Collins presided over, every verdict he rendered, was tainted by the knowledge that he had been willing to sell his authority for cash. In 1989, a convicted drug smuggler sought a reduced prison sentence. Rather than petition the court through legitimate legal channels, the smuggler's associates approached Robert Collins with an offer: $100,000 in cash in exchange for a lighter sentence. Collins accepted. What he did not know was that the drug smuggler was cooperating with the FBI. The entire transaction was part of a federal sting operation designed to expose judicial corruption. The FBI had been investigating Collins, and the smuggler's cooperation gave them the opportunity to catch him in the act. The $100,000 bribe was marked, meaning that the bills could be traced directly to the sting operation. Collins accepted the money and agreed to reduce the smuggler's sentence. The transaction was documented, recorded, and preserved as evidence. Federal agents obtained a warrant and raided Collins' chambers. They found $16,500 of the marked money in his office safe, physical proof that he had accepted the bribe. The remaining money had been split with a middleman, a go-between who had facilitated the transaction. Robert Collins was arrested and charged with bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The FBI had recordings of the transaction, the marked money recovered from his safe, and the testimony of the cooperating drug smuggler. Collins pleaded not guilty and took the case to trial. In 1991, a jury heard the evidence and convicted him on all counts. The conviction was historic. Collins became the first federal judge in United States history to be convicted of bribery. The case sent shockwaves through the federal judiciary and became a symbol of the need for accountability, even at the highest levels of the legal system. The court sentenced Robert Collins to 6 years and 10 months in federal prison. He served 12 years before being released, a discrepancy that suggests he may have faced additional charges or complications during his incarceration. Robert Frederick Collins died in 2001. The man who had been celebrated as a trailblazer, the first African-American federal judge in the Deep South, is now remembered primarily for his conviction. His appointment had been a moment of hope, a sign that the federal judiciary was evolving and that barriers were being broken. His bribery conviction was a betrayal not only of his judicial oath, but of the communities who had celebrated his appointment and who had seen him as a symbol of progress. The FBI's recovery of $16,500 in marked bills from his office safe was a damning piece of evidence, physical proof that a federal judge had sold his authority for cash. The drug smuggler whose sentence Collins had agreed to reduce was part of a sting operation, meaning that Collins walked directly into a trap set by federal investigators. His willingness to accept the bribe, despite the risks, demonstrated either arrogance or desperation. The case established a precedent. No judge, regardless of how historic or respected their appointment, is above the law. For the federal judiciary, the conviction was a humiliation. For Robert Collins, it was the end of a legacy that could have been defined by courage and progress, but instead became a cautionary tale about corruption and the abuse of power. Case 8. Richard Baumgartner. Dozens of major criminal convictions, including high-profile murder cases, had to be retried at massive taxpayer expense because the judge who had presided over the trials was high on painkillers he had purchased from the criminals he had sentenced. Richard Baumgartner was a Knox County criminal court judge in Tennessee, and by 2009, he was addicted to prescription painkillers. To feed his addiction, he bought pills from defendants and felons who appeared in his courtroom. He manipulated the probation of Dina Castleman, a woman on supervised release for a felony conviction, coercing her into sex in his chambers in exchange for keeping her out of jail and supplying him with pills. He presided over serious felony trials, including murder cases, while incapacitated by drugs. When his addiction and misconduct were finally exposed, the legal system was thrown into chaos. Convictions had to be overturned because the presiding judge had been impaired. Baumgartner was charged with federal misprision of a felony and official misconduct. He was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison and released. He died in 2018, but the damage he caused to the justice system and to the victims whose cases he presided over will never be fully repaired. Richard Baumgartner was 64 years old when his crimes were discovered. He served as a Knox County criminal court judge in Tennessee, a position that gave him authority over some of the most serious criminal cases in the county, including murder trials and other violent felonies. The details of his early career and his path to the bench are not extensively documented, but by 2009, Baumgartner was battling an addiction to prescription painkillers that had spiraled out of control. Addiction is a powerful force, and Baumgartner's response to it was to exploit the very people who appeared before him in court, turning his position of authority into a means of feeding his dependency and engaging in criminal behavior. Dina Castleman was an adult woman on probation for a felony conviction. Her probation was supervised by the court, meaning that Baumgartner had direct authority over whether she remained free or was sent to prison for violating the terms of her release. The power imbalance was absolute. Baumgartner exploited that imbalance, manipulating Castleman's probation and coercing her into sex in his chambers. The exchange was explicit. She would provide him with sexual favors and supply him with painkillers, and in return, he would ensure that her probation violations were overlooked and that she remained out of jail. Castleman was trapped by the very system that was supposed to protect her. Also victimized were court reporters, police officers, and trial participants who were forced to endure Baumgartner's impaired behavior during serious criminal proceedings. Defendants whose cases Baumgartner presided over while incapacitated were also victimized, as the integrity of their trials was compromised by a judge who was not mentally or physically capable of administering justice. Between 2009 and 2010, Richard Baumgartner bought prescription painkillers from criminals he had sentenced. The transactions occurred outside the courtroom, but the relationships that facilitated them were forged inside it. Baumgartner used his position as a judge to identify potential sources for pills, targeting defendants and felons who were desperate to curry favor with the man who controlled their fates. At the same time, Baumgartner manipulated Dina Castleman's probation. He coerced her into engaging in sex acts in his chambers, using the threat of imprisonment as leverage. The coercion was sustained over time, a pattern of abuse that left Castleman with no realistic option to refuse. In exchange for the sexual favors, Baumgartner supplied Castleman with painkillers and ensured that her probation violations were not reported or acted upon. While this abuse was ongoing, Baumgartner continued to preside over serious criminal trials. He sat on the bench during murder cases, felony assault prosecutions, and other matters where defendants' lives and liberties hung in the balance. He was high, his judgment was impaired, his ability to fairly evaluate evidence, to make sound legal rulings, and to ensure that justice was administered impartially, was compromised by his addiction. Informants eventually tipped off the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation about Baumgartner's behavior. The TBI opened an investigation and began gathering evidence of his drug use, his coercion of Castleman, and his impaired conduct on the bench. The investigation revealed the full scope of Baumgartner's misconduct. federal prosecutors charged him with misprision of a felony, a charge related to his knowledge of crimes and his failure to report them, and official misconduct, a charge stemming from his abuse of his judicial authority. The evidence was strong enough that Baumgartner chose not to fight the charges. He entered a guilty plea and admitted to the conduct. The court sentenced Richard Baumgartner to 6 months in federal prison, a shockingly light sentence given the severity of his crimes and the systemic damage he had caused. The sentencing judge's reasoning is not documented, but the brevity of the sentence sparked outrage among victims' advocates and legal observers who believed that Baumgartner deserved far more time. The true punishment, however, came in the form of the legal chaos his misconduct created. Because Baumgartner had presided over major criminal trials while incapacitated, appellate courts were forced to reconsider convictions. Dozens of cases, including high-profile murder prosecutions, had to be retried. The retrials cost taxpayers millions of dollars and forced victims' families to relive the trauma of the original crimes as they sat through new trials. Some convictions were upheld, others were overturned. The integrity of the entire Knox County criminal justice system was called into question. Richard Baumgartner died in 2018. His age at death is not publicly documented, but he lived long enough to see the full extent of the damage he had caused. Dina Castleman, the woman he had coerced and manipulated, was left to rebuild her life after years of being victimized by a man who was supposed to administer justice. The defendants whose cases Baumgartner presided over, while high, were left in legal limbo, their convictions tainted by his incapacity. The families of murder victims were forced to endure retrials, sitting through new proceedings and reliving the loss of their loved ones because a judge had been too addicted to painkillers to do his job. Baumgartner turned his courtroom into a marketplace for drugs and sex, buying pills from the criminals he had sentenced and coercing a vulnerable woman into sexual acts in exchange for leniency. The 6 months he spent in federal prison was a fraction of the harm he caused, a sentence that failed to reflect the betrayal of trust, the corruption of the judicial process, and the suffering inflicted on everyone who had depended on him to administer justice fairly. Case 9. Donald Thompson. A court reporter in Creek County, Oklahoma, sat at her station taking notes during a serious felony trial and realized she could see directly under the judge's transparent glass desk. What she saw shocked her. District Judge Donald D. Thompson was using a penis pump while presiding over the trial. The behavior was not isolated. Thompson routinely exposed himself and used the device on the bench during multiple trials over a 2-year period, including during the murder trial of a man accused of killing a police officer. The court reporter eventually reported what she had witnessed to police, and investigators raided Thompson's chambers, recovering the device. In 2006, Thompson was convicted of 4 felony counts of indecent exposure. He was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, a punishment that reflected not only the criminal nature of his actions, but the utter contempt he had shown for the dignity of the courtroom and the gravity of the cases before him. Donald D. Thompson was 59 years old when his crimes were discovered. He served as a district judge in Creek County, Oklahoma, a position that gave him authority over criminal and civil cases in a rural county southeast of Tulsa. The details of his career and his path to the bench are not extensively documented, but by 2001, Thompson was a sitting judge, presiding over serious felony cases, including murder trials. His conduct on the bench during those trials demonstrated a complete disregard for the responsibilities of his office and for the people whose lives and liberties depended on his impartial judgment. The victims of Donald Thompson's crimes were the court reporters who were forced to witness his behavior, the police officers who testified in trials he presided over, the attorneys and trial participants who unknowingly appeared before a judge engaged in sexual acts, and the defendants whose trials were tainted by his misconduct. Among those defendants was a man on trial for murdering a police officer, a case of immense gravity that required the full attention and solemnity of the court. Instead, the presiding judge was using a sexual device while the trial proceeded. The families of crime victims who attended trials seeking justice were also victimized, forced to sit in a courtroom where the judge was engaging in behavior that mocked the seriousness of the proceedings. Between 2001 and 2003, Donald Thompson routinely exposed his genitals and used a penis pump while sitting on the bench during felony trials. The behavior occurred in open court, during active proceedings, while witnesses testified, attorneys argued, and juries deliberated. Thompson's desk had a transparent glass surface, which meant that the court reporter seated below and to the side of the bench could see directly underneath it. What she saw was Thompson engaging in sexual acts while presiding over trials. The behavior was not a one-time lapse in judgment. It was routine, occurring over the course of 2 years during multiple trials. The most egregious instance occurred during the trial of a man accused of murdering a police officer. The murder of a law enforcement officer is one of the most serious crimes that can be prosecuted, and the trial should have been conducted with the utmost professionalism and respect. Instead, the presiding judge was using a sexual device on the bench, showing absolute contempt for the gravity of the case and for everyone involved in the proceedings. The court reporter who witnessed Thompson's behavior eventually went to the police. Her decision to come forward was courageous, as reporting a sitting judge for criminal conduct carried significant professional risks. Police opened an investigation and obtained a warrant to search Thompson's chambers. During the search, investigators found the penis pump, physical evidence that corroborated the court reporter's account. Thompson was arrested and charged with 4 felony counts of indecent exposure, each count corresponding to a separate instance of the behavior during different trials. The trial took place in 2006. The court reporter testified about what she had witnessed, describing in detail the behavior she had observed from her position at the bench. Police officers testified about the search of Thompson's chambers and the recovery of the device. The evidence was compelling, and the jury convicted Donald Thompson on all 4 felony counts of indecent exposure. The verdict was a rare instance of a sitting judge being held criminally accountable for conduct that occurred while he was on the bench. The court sentenced Donald Thompson to 4 years in state prison. The sentence reflected the seriousness of his crimes and the betrayal of trust he had committed. Thompson was removed from the bench, and his judicial career was over. He served his sentence and was released. His current age and whereabouts are not publicly documented, but the legacy of his case is clear. He engaged in sexual behavior while presiding over the trial of a man accused of murdering a police officer, demonstrating complete contempt for the gravity of the courtroom and the responsibilities of his office. The court reporter who witnessed his behavior sat at her desk day after day, forced to endure the knowledge of what was happening just feet away from her, until she finally found the courage to report it. The defendants whose trials Thompson presided over, the victims' families who attended those trials, and the attorneys and witnesses who participated in the proceedings were all subjected to a grotesque violation of the courtroom's dignity. Thompson's behavior during the murder trial of the man accused of killing a police officer is particularly disturbing, as it revealed not only his personal depravity, but his absolute lack of respect for the legal process and for the people whose lives depended on his impartiality. The transparent glass desk that allowed the court reporter to see what Thompson was doing became the instrument of his exposure, a fitting irony for a man who had shown no shame in engaging in such behavior in the first place. Case 10. Joseph Waters. "You're my guy. I'll do whatever you need." Those words, spoken by Cook County Judge Joseph Waters and captured on an FBI recording, summed up his approach to the bench. Waters was not administering justice. He was running a criminal enterprise from the courthouse, accepting cash bribes from a corrupt attorney to fix civil and criminal cases. He dismissed gun charges against dangerous defendants, ruled in favor of parties who had paid him off, and treated the courtroom as a marketplace where verdicts were bought and sold. An FBI informant secretly recorded Waters accepting cash and making deals, preserving his words as evidence of a corruption so blatant that it shocked even seasoned investigators. In 2015, after pleading guilty to mail fraud and bribery, Waters was sentenced to 41 months in federal prison. He operated less like a judge and more like a made member of an organized crime syndicate, and the recordings left no doubt about his guilt. Joseph Waters was 61 years old when his crimes were discovered. He served as a Cook County judge in Illinois, presiding over civil and criminal cases in one of the nation's largest and busiest court systems. The details of his background and his path to the bench are not extensively documented, but by 2011, Waters was a sitting judge with the authority to decide the fates of litigants and defendants who appeared before him. What he did with that authority was sell it to the highest bidder. The victims of Joseph Waters' corruption were the litigants in civil cases who lost because the opposing party had paid the judge, the victims of crimes whose cases Waters dismissed after accepting bribes, and the public who expected the Cook County courts to administer justice impartially. Among the most troubling of Waters' actions was his willingness to dismiss gun charges against dangerous defendants in exchange for cash payments. Those defendants, freed by a corrupt judge, returned to the streets where they posed a continuing threat to public safety. Every honest party who appeared before Waters, every victim who sought justice, and every citizen who relied on the integrity of the courts was victimized by his corruption. Between 2011 and 2012, Joseph Waters accepted cash bribes from a corrupt attorney to fix civil and criminal cases. The attorney, who was either an FBI informant or working with one, approached Waters with offers of money in exchange for favorable rulings. Waters accepted. The transactions were straightforward. The attorney would pay Waters cash, and Waters would rule in favor of the attorney's clients. In civil cases, Waters ignored the evidence and the law, ruling for parties who had paid him off regardless of the merits of their claims. In criminal cases, Waters dismissed charges, including gun offenses against dangerous defendants, in exchange for cash payments. The FBI informant secretly recorded the meetings between Waters and the attorney. The recordings captured Waters accepting cash, discussing the cases he would fix, and making statements that left no doubt about his willingness to sell his authority. In one recording, Waters told the attorney, "You're my guy. I'll do whatever you need." The statement was not a figure of speech. It was a confession. Waters was explicitly offering to do whatever the attorney asked in exchange for continued payments. The FBI had been investigating Waters as part of a broader effort to root out corruption in the Cook County court system. The recordings provided compelling evidence of bribery and fraud. Federal prosecutors charged Waters with mail fraud and bribery, crimes that carried significant prison time. Waters, faced with the recordings and the testimony of the FBI informant, chose not to fight the charges. He pleaded guilty, admitting to the bribery scheme and waiving his right to trial. In 2015, Joseph Waters was sentenced to 41 months in federal prison. The sentencing judge's name and specific remarks are not documented, but the sentence reflected the seriousness of Waters' betrayal. 41 months is just over 3 years, a relatively light sentence given the scope of the corruption and the number of cases Waters had fixed. Federal sentences require defendants to serve at least 85% of their time, meaning that Waters likely spent approximately 3 years in custody before being released. His current age and whereabouts are not publicly documented, but his conviction and disbarment are permanent. Joseph Waters is no longer a judge. He was released from federal prison after serving his sentence, and he will never practice law or preside over a courtroom again. The case became a symbol of the corruption that had plagued the Cook County court system for decades, part of a long history of judges and attorneys who treated the courts as criminal enterprises. The FBI recordings of Waters accepting cash and promising to fix cases were played in court and reported in the media, providing the public with a rare glimpse into the mechanics of judicial corruption. Waters' statement, "You're my guy, I'll do whatever you need," became a shorthand for the kind of transactional relationship that undermines the rule of law. He was not a judge deliberating on the facts and applying the law. He was a fixer, a man who sold verdicts to the highest bidder. The defendants he freed, including those charged with gun offenses, returned to the streets because a judge had been paid to dismiss their cases. The litigants who lost civil cases they should have won did so because the opposing party had paid off the judge. Waters operated less like a member of the judiciary and more like a member of an organized crime syndicate, and the FBI recordings made that clear. His 41 months in federal prison was a small price to pay for the damage he caused to the integrity of the Cook County courts and to every person who had relied on the court system to deliver fair outcomes.